everybody. My name is Angie Abdou. I'm a writer and a creative writing professor and a book reviewer. I live in Fernie, BC, but my home is Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. I haven't, thank you. I haven't lived here since 1987, but I still say I'm going home when I go to Moose Jaw. And one of the things that makes me so proud to be a Moose Javian is this amazing festival that we have every year. And that the team, Sarah and the team, kept it going through COVID, and that you're all back, and it's really a beautiful, beautiful thing, and it makes me proud to come back here. So thank you to everyone involved in the festival, including all the sponsors and the Cultural Center, and Sarah and Amanda and that whole team especially. I was thinking one of the first times, I came the very first festival, I was living in Ontario, going to grad school, and I heard there was starting, Gary Highland and his friends were starting a literary festival. And I came back for it, and I think it was around then I heard Ken Mitchell play the song, Is There Anybody Here from Moose Jaw? Do you know that song? Yeah, if you don't know it, it's like everywhere you go, there's somebody from Moose Jaw, and he just gets farther and farther away, but always somebody from Moose Jaw. At the end, he goes to Mars, and all the Martians are dancing around as there's somebody there from Moose Jaw. And I was thinking about this because right near the start of COVID, my family and I went on this very remote camping trip, and we drove for about 15 hours on highways, and then 3 more hours on back roads, and then hiked our canoe into this little spot. And there was 4 people at the trailhead, and one of them was Joanne Livingston, Barb and John's daughter. And I'm like, oh, hey, Joanne. And she's like, hey, Angie. And my son, who was 14, like, of course, there's somebody here from Moose Jaw. So everywhere you go. And I'm very proud to be from Moose Jaw. This is Suzette Mayr, who I'm thrilled to be introducing today and interviewing. I have a personal connection to Suzette because my very first novel that I wrote, The Bone Cage, Suzette was the editor. And when my edits went into her, I was so excited to have my first book coming out for publication. And when they came back, there were so many comments on them, I cried. But then once I finished crying, I did everything she said. And to this day, I always say to people, the most I ever learned from writing was working with Suzette Mayr as my editor. I learned so much from you. And then because I enjoyed that process so much, I found out she was at University of Calgary. And I had abandoned a PhD, but I thought if I could go back and finish a PhD with Suzette as my supervisor and write a novel as my dissertation, I'd be crazy not to. So I went to U of C, I redid all my coursework and all my candidacy exams to fight my way back to Suzette, and then she was my supervisor, and I wrote the novel The Canterbury Trail with Suzette as my supervisor, which led to this beautiful job I have working at Athabasca University. So I owe much of my career to you. It's true.
You wrote the books.
Anyways, so I have this strong personal connection, which makes me really thrilled with the success that Suzette has had. All of her novels have been critically acclaimed and listed for a variety of awards. And I feel like I think of you a bit as a writer's writer. Like all writers know you and admire your work and appreciate what you do, but you weren't necessarily a household name until this fall when she won the Giller Prize, the award of all awards, for the Sleeping Car Porter. And it was so exciting to watch that, like long listed again, like Monoceros, and then she made the short list, and just this excitement of that and watching the big grand tour. And then I don't know how many of you are watching on TV, but when she won, I've never seen such unanimous, well, Canlit community is not really unanimous about anything, but I've never seen such a unanimous outpouring of joy and euphoria and elation. Everybody's so happy to see you win. And because it's hard to think of a publisher that deserves that success more, a writer that deserves that success more, or a book. So welcome to the Giller Prize winning author, Suzette Mayr. Thank you. Is this your first time in Moose Jaw?
No, it's my second time in Moose Jaw.
Second time.
Yeah, I was here 30 years ago on a road trip to Saskatoon.
Very nice. I want to talk a little bit about what we're going to do. We're going to talk about you, and then we're going to talk about the Sleeping Car Porter, and then we're going to talk about the Giller experience, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So before we get to your book, I want to talk a little bit about you and go way back to when did you first know you wanted to be a writer?
I first knew I wanted to be a writer probably, I want to say maybe second or third year university. I got into university, so I was probably about 18 or 19, got into university and I was going to go into the sciences. I wanted to do something having to do with zoology or veterinary studies or something like that. And I was taking biology courses and chemistry courses and all kinds of courses, and I realized that biology in university is not the same as biology in high school, because biology in high school is let's go into the forest and look at mushrooms, and in university it was like let's sit with our test tubes and look at Drosophila melanogasters under the microscope, so fruit flies, and kill the fruit flies. Anyway, so basically what happened was I was kind of a little bit lost, but I was doing really well in my English courses, surprisingly enough, because I was not remarkable as an English student in high school. And there was one day in particular, which is a story I've told before, but I think this is the day it was born, me wanting to write, it was a very rainy day, and there were earthworms all over the sidewalk, and I'm one of those people who doesn't want to step on earthworms, and so I'm kind of dancing around the sidewalk, trying not to step on them, and I accidentally stepped on one, and I heard it pop.
Ew.
And so it was this very epiphanic kind of synesthetic moment where it was a sound, but it was actually, but there's no way I could have actually heard it, so it was actually a texture. And I thought, I want to record this, and I didn't know how to record it. I thought, can I draw it or paint it or something? And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to write it down. I'm going to see what this is. And in writing it down, I think that was pretty much probably my first poem.
Wow.
And after that, rather than, approaching the natural world from the science perspective, I was approaching it from a more poetic perspective. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to write about... Worm guts, yeah. I'm going to write about this crow I saw. I'm going to write about my dog. I'm going to write about whatever. And I took those poems, and there was a creative writing poetry, first-year poetry class with Chris Wiseman, and I handed in my poems, not knowing what to expect, and I got in. And then I got hooked for the rest of my life.
I want to talk more about poetry, but first I'm really curious, what made you not a remarkable English student in high school and then a noteworthy English student in university? What was the difference?
I don't know. It's not that I didn't enjoy English. I did. I loved Macbeth. I loved those books. But I think my problem was that the essays we were supposed to write just felt very mechanical to me. And I was not very confident grammar-wise. I'm very much a run-on sentence kind of person, and there's just no room for that in high school because we had departmentals to study for, and an essay is supposed to look like this. But in university, there was a lot more freedom in terms of form, so you could be a little bit weirder in terms of form if your argument was coherent enough, and I really like that. I love that I could argue any point as long as I had evidence, no matter how esoteric and bizarre it might be.
Weirdness is another thing I want to come back to, because I feel that word always comes up when I describe your work to people, as well as esoteric and bizarre, in the best way. Were you a book person in high school, though? Did you love books back in high school, or is that new? What were your favorite books growing up? What kind of did you read?
Really loved, I guess what they'd call the classics. So I loved, like Harriet the Spy, Wrinkle in Time. There was a book I loved a lot, and I read it every year, which was The Ghost Belonged to Me by Richard Peck. I was completely one of those kids who would go to the library and get a whole stack of books and then have to, lug it home under the beating sun. And I always wanted to be also one of those kids who got the medal. You know how there were like those sticker medals you could get if you read enough books, and I never made it, but I enjoyed it. And I think also I was kind of an embryonic writer when I was young because I always had a journal of some kind, but the journal or the diary was not, I'd write about my feelings and how I hated people or whatever, but then it was also about, it was basically fan fiction, 1970s fan fiction, because, I don't know if people remember that show, Battle of the Network Stars, where, all the actors from the Partridge Family would be running an obstacle race against all of the actors from the Hardy Boys, and then I would write fan fictions about, well, Keith Partridge should have won that, or,
Yeah.
It was always there, it just wasn't, I never recognized it as
What was
such.
the name of the Richard Peck book that you mentioned?
The Ghost Belonged to Me.
Ghost Belonged to Me, and you read it every year.
I read it
since
every year.
When? Do you still read it every year?
I didn't. I didn't read it for a long time. I didn't have a copy of it because there was a very specific library copy that I loved.
That you stole.
Did not.
That you forgot to return.
I'm a rule follower. No, but I bought a copy just out of nostalgia, and it was on my shelf, and I didn't touch it. And then last summer, I got COVID, and I think something happened to my brain where I went back to teenagehood, and being very young, and so I was only reading children's books, and I took that book out and read it. And it was so cool, because I think the magic of that book is that every time you read it, it's a little bit different. So reading it as a 13-year-old is much different from reading it as someone in your 50s, because he pitches that book to all ages. So there are all kinds of strange kind of sexual innuendos that as a 13-year-old I completely miss, and the character, who's, I don't know, I think he's about 12, he misses them, but now I'm like, holy smokes. It's really rich. It's a very rich book. And the other thing I found out about that author, which was not something people talked about at the time when that book came out, it turned out that he was a gay man. And I think that the book had that kind of sensibility, like a kind of outsider perspective that really appealed to me and resonated with me, even though I didn't know about my sexuality really, but it felt like a kindred spirit.
Interesting. Are there other ways, looking back, that book influenced your own writing, do you think, when you came back to it as a 50-year-old?
I love the supernatural, and what's particularly interesting about that book is that it's about a boy who is trying to rescue a girl who died on the Titanic. And he's got this incredible empathy, and he pays incredible attention to detail, and that's why he can save her, because of that empathy and the fact that he's the only one who notices the traces she's leaving behind. Yeah.
Nice. And your books always have, well, we'll get to that later, but some kind of supernatural or magic realism quality, which is neat, because fiction, you can do anything, and I feel like you take advantage of that. Anything might happen in your books. But I want to talk first about your poetry. You said you started as a poet, writing about squished earthworms and birds in the trees. And then what made you, because you don't write poetry at all anymore.
No.
But your books have a poetic kind of characteristics, but what made you move from poetry to novels, and when?
I think I just burned out on poetry, because so I was writing, I started getting into poetry classes. I was writing poetry. Fiction was for losers. Poetry's the way to go. You know, I was one of those poetry snobs, and so I went ahead and did my master's degree, and my thesis was a poetry book. And after I wrote that thesis, I kind of never wanted to look at poetry again. I was just very tired, and it had become work. The other element of it was that I think what was happening to me was that I was wanting more and more story and more character development, and I was not prepared to write the Iliad. You know, I wasn't prepared to write an long epic poem. I wanted to be very bald about it. And I remember specifically the moment I started like taking fiction seriously was when I had finished my MA thesis, and I was trying to get that book of poetry published, which it just never did get published. And
I bet you can publish it now.
I wouldn't want to. What was happening to me was that I wasn't writing at all. I was just kind of a workshop-aholic. So I would go to a lot of workshops, but I never actually wrote anything. I never published anything. And there was one day where I had the choice between going to this extremely important poetry conference or writing conference. It was the Appropriate Voice, actually. I could go to that conference, or I could go to my friend Deb's wedding. And I decided to go to Deb's wedding. And it was magic, because the wedding was so fun and so strange. There was all kinds of homoerotic escapades happening among the groomsmen. And I thought, I want to write this down. And so I thought, I'll just write a story. But fiction is, for me, poetry was the bicycle you could take. And fiction was the Mack truck that you were taking. So it's like poetry was far more elegant, but I thought, you know what, I'm not a writer anyway. I'm just gonna start writing some prose. And I just wrote all summer and showed this work to a friend of mine, and it was just this very floppy 50-page short story, and she said, I don't think this is a short story. I think this is a novel. And so it became the first novel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And in the process, so you abandoned writing poetry, did you abandon reading poetry, or are there certain poets that you still...
There are certain poets I gravitate to. I think they're more on the lyric side, part of me giving up poetry too was that it was coinciding with that very, very experimental phase, that, very kind of, I don't know, more machine-oriented, language-oriented poetry, and it just was not, it wasn't, I could appreciate it, but it wasn't doing it for me. Like, I wanted to write about my dog, but this was all about writing loftier things and loftier language with certain forms that it just didn't resonate. Didn't resonate for me.
So people often say that your writing's poetic or experimental or has poetic qualities. Would you agree with that? And what does that mean for you?
Yeah, I would agree. I think I remain a poet in that I don't like the tyranny of the sentence. That whole subject, verb, object, subject, predicate kind of structure. I don't like it. And as a result, I'll often play with, I was really impressed by what Allen Ginsberg did with Howl, where it's based on breath. And I thought, I'm going to make my poetry or my writing, it's going to be more breath-oriented, so more like Gertrude Stein, Virginia Woolfish than anything
the musical
else.
quality.
Musical, yeah. And I realized I didn't answer your question about which poets I read. I tend to gravitate more to, like right now I'm reading Susan Musgrave's Sculpatory Lilies. It's so beautiful.
And it's done so well. It
Oh,
made the new
it's
Griffin
done so
Prize,
well, yeah. Just beautiful. But I also really loved, Anne Sexton.
Yeah.
And like just that kind of so-called confessional poetry. Yeah, yeah.
So now you write novels, that's what you do, and this might seem like a weird question, but I want you to explain what the word novel means to you, because I think it might mean something different to you than it means to some people in the audience, and that your novels are not mainstream contemporary novels that you buy at the Walmart or whatever. There's something unique about them, and I think it might be related to how you define novel.
That is such a good question. I think you're right. When I think of novels, I think of the ones you see at grocery stores. Those are like proper thick books. And what I'm writing it's so-called literary fiction, which is a term I've never agreed with. I think everything is literary, really. But a novel also sounds to me like, and why would I run from this tradition? I don't know, it just seems very genteel lady in the parlor who, is not allowed to get a job. So what does she do? She kind of like writes with her quill pen dipping into the ink and trying not to get it on her dress. That's what it sounds like. I write fiction books, I think. I just write fiction, and it happens to be long. Although this book, took forever. And then when the editor got through with it, it was so short. I thought this was more of a pamphlet. I could not believe how short it was. And the other thing, too, that happened because of the Giller was that the original paper it was on was this beautiful paper that Coach House Press gets made, and it's very thick and gorgeous. And then when I won the Giller, suddenly they had to go for regular paperback book, and so the book like shrank, like it literally shrank to about half the size. It was so depressing. So novels, I think novels are like thick and amazing, and what I'm writing is like fiction, long fiction, I guess.
I think the word novel, in its original meaning, though, is something unique and unprecedented. Each one of your novels, to me, is something unique and unprecedented. Like, it should be new. Is that a criteria you hold yourself to, that you need to be doing something new?
Yes, yeah. I want to do a different book every time. I know that there are some writers who we seek out because we know what we'll get.
Yeah, like Miriam Toews.
Miriam
Love
Toews,
her, but you know what you're going to get.
You know exactly what you're going to get. Alice Munro, you can tell what an Alice Munro story is. Agatha Christie, that's what you want, right? But for me, I'm not that interested in doing the same thing over and over again. I want to have like another challenge each time, which, yeah.
And people have talked a lot, and we'll get to this, about all the research you put into the Sleeping Car Porter, but all of your books have an element of research. It's not necessarily foregrounded. So can you talk a little bit, I think if someone comes to your books, they would think, oh, she's a poet, she has beautiful use of language, it's very original, she's imaginative, it's magic realism, she goes into fantasy, so it's this creative pursuit. But people might not stop to think about the research that grounds those books. So can you talk about the role of research in your
Yeah,
process?
yeah, there's always research, and I think it might, I think about it, I think every writer probably does research of some kind, but I have to be especially aware of it because I work in an academic institution where they want you to talk about your like your capital R research. So for the last book I did, I wrote Dr. Edith Vane and the Hares of Crawley Hall. That was a Gothic campus novel, and so what I did in order to write that book, so it's about a professor on a campus, which is, that's a very specific genre. It's the campus novel, and writing about the hijinks that happen on campuses. But it was also a haunted house narrative because she's working in a building that's trying to kill her. And so I was very careful to read all of the campus novels I could find and figure out, okay, what are the conventions of this genre? Which are the ones that I like and that I want to emulate, and which ones are just not doing it for me? And then I also was looking specifically at the sentient house genre. So actually that book was my PhD thesis. Yeah, and I had to write, so I wrote the novel, but then I also had to write like an accompanying extremely long essay. And so I looked at the sentient house in Canadian and Australian literature. And sentient houses are different from haunted houses because haunted houses it's basically just a building and there are ghosts in it. So the house is a vessel, whereas with sentient houses, the uncanniness is actually in the bones of the house. So, Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher. The problem with the House of Usher is that there's something in the collocation of the stones, or in Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. The beginning of that book opens with this beautiful, of course I can't remember it, but it's something about, every living organism, and it talks about the sanity of this living organism. So the house is this living organism. The research for that book was me looking at, okay, what have people written before? What hasn't been done? What can I do? And then also watching a lot of horror movies and figuring out, how do I get that? How do I get a jump scare onto the page? And every book is kind of like that, even for my very first book, when I didn't realize that I was actually writing a book, I was thinking very carefully about weddings and what they mean and the symbolism around weddings and how they've been represented in fiction and who's done what and how am I going to make this wedding book different from other wedding books. So it's about figuring out context. A lot of it's what has been done before because I want to do something different, but it doesn't mean that I can't see what's been done before and be inspired by that.
And so there's that kind of research of, I always tell my students that, literature is this conversation that's been going on forever, and you can't imagine that you're going to insert yourself into it without reading. So you're reading to find out what is the conversation and who am I responding to and what new do I have to say and where do I insert myself into it. But then there's also the kind of research where you're making sure you get it right in the novel of your book. So is it monoceros or monoceros?
Monoceros, yeah.
Those are two words I've been saying wrong for a long time. Monoceros, which is the Latinate version of unicorn. In that book, you did research to make sure because a young gay boy in the high school commits suicide, so you interviewed parents of people.
No, I didn't do that. But I read a lot about my wanting to come to that book was because my partner was teaching in a high school at the time, in a Catholic high school, and she was in the closet because she was a lesbian, and if she'd come out, she probably would have lost her job. And there was a young man who died by suicide after being bullied for being gay in the school. And it was radical. It was radical because it was horrible. It was tragic. And my partner also decided that she wanted to change her life entirely, and she wanted to quit the job and go work and go write a thesis, like go to grad school and write about homophobia in Canadian Catholic schools. And what happened was that I wanted to write about it, but I didn't know how to write about it. So even though I didn't know this young man and my partner hadn't even taught him, he impacted us. There were massive ripple effects as the result of his death. And I wanted to know, how can I write this and do it respectfully without scooping, without co-opting and appropriating other people's feelings. And I just read as much as I could, I read as much as I could about literature about suicide, or read as much literature about suicide as I could, including, books of fiction, but also nonfiction. And so that's where I read
right
a
from the
lot of
parents.
books written by parents who lost their children, and I listened to I think there was an interview on CBC, and what was really significant to me was that for all of those parents, there was a kind of speechlessness around the death. They could not articulate what it felt like past a certain point. And so for that book, in order to make it unique, I thought, you know what, I'm going to talk about disenfranchised mourners, and that's where the research ended up. So people who are impacted by a death, but technically aren't related to the person who has died, because I found that all of the narratives were about the person who died by suicide and their immediate family and friends. And everybody else just did not. They did not figure into it. And I was part of that group that was outside, that had been affected and was also in mourning. And so examples of this would be, I don't know, for example, I don't know if there's like, upstanding husband and father who dies, and it's the secret lover.
Yeah, who
who's
can never.
in the car outside of the funeral home, for example. Or if you mourn your dog, deaths of pets are not recognized as legitimate. That's not a site of legitimate grief, even though, there are pet cemeteries, et cetera, but really, you're not supposed to take a day off work for that, for example. So it was me looking at different ways that people feel grief and express grief, and how do you do that. The book became very difficult as a result of that, because I realized that with all those other fictions, what the glue for the book was looking at that person who had died and then looking at the people around them. And what I wanted to do was talk about, 6th, 7th, 8th degrees of separation, and there was no way to give all of these people on the periphery, how would they ever meet each other? How would they, it was just so, that book took a long time as well, because it was just so scattered, and trying to figure out, okay, how do I bring all these characters together in one book and make it make sense? That took a long time.
And I highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't read Monoceros. I'd say it's one of my all-time favorite books ever. It's so important and so powerful and so well written. And because not only is everybody grieving, everybody's sort of implicated in the death or feels some degree of responsibility for the death.
Yeah, and the issue too was that it started being funny. It became this kind of tragicomedy, not because I was trying to make it funny, but because I thoroughly believe in that adage that comedy is tragedy at a distance, right? So you have a character who is mourning this boy, but at the same time she's having a bad hair day, and is talking about her hair. So it's this weird disconnect that people who read it found it very funny, even though I never intended it to be funny. It just kind of
there is humor in
it, flipped into that. Yeah.
Before we talk about the sleeping car porter, yesterday we had a book club, so we had 3 hours of talking about the sleeping car porter, and Suzette came in and joined us for the last hour. And one thing we ended up talking about was how at one point you had moved to bigger publishers and an agent, and you kept writing what you like to write, which is eventually didn't work out for them, and now you're with Coach House, who you're very happy with and you're sticking with. And you talked about the importance of writing on your own terms, and that you're going to continue write on your own terms, what you can do with Coach House in Atlanta. Can you tell me what that means, to write on your own terms?
It means being faithful, or listening to what I need to do as a writer, listening to what the text wants to do without worrying about will everybody like this book? Will this resonate with that audience or with that audience? Or am I writing it for an agent who wants to sell X number of units? I find that when I think about audience, then that's when I get in trouble. It's about writing for myself, I guess, and figuring out, I think writing for me, writing fiction is about excavating my own psychology and the relationships in my life, really. That's kind of the question that I ask over and over and over again. And why do people do the things they do? And how come, there is good and evil in the world, and sometimes they coexist in the same person, where you can love somebody who's absolutely terrible, and how do you negotiate that? And with Coach House, they're remarkable because they're kind of like the weirder the better. And one of the, I'll never forget how growing up, often, I was the different kid and the weird kid, and what I did was odd. And really that was, there could have been race involved in that, but I think it was also like, well, no, I see things differently, and it's also valuable. It's not status quo, and it's not normal. That doesn't mean it's valuable.
I'm
And
not
Coach
looking
House-
at my friends right now because they're probably laughing, saying, just like you,
Just
you're
like
weird
you."
too.
So Coach House is kind of like the freakier you are, the more welcome you are, which
Perfect.
makes it home. Yeah.
So you talk about writing to figure out your own life and figuring out people around you and figuring out how things work. Is there also any elements, like I don't know if you want to say spiritual or mysterious, like is there some part of your writing that you don't know where, like that's the part you figuring out. Is there another part that comes in that you don't know where it comes from? Like
Yeah,
people-
yeah. I mean,
Is
as
that
much
part
as
of the weirdness? Or
yeah, I mean, as much as as authors, we're asked over and over again, why did this character do this and why did they do that? Sometimes you have no idea, but you can't give that answer because you're supposed to look like you're in control of the process. And there are instincts that kick into place that you don't know where it came from, and being able to follow that for as long as you can.
That
I
worrying
think
about
is
whether or not it will sell.
Yeah, or if this is too weird and off-putting, being able to follow that snake's tail to wherever it takes you is super, super important.
When we talk about the sleeping car porter, Fred Waugh's name comes up a lot. Can you talk about who Fred Waugh is? Some people might not know about who he is here, and then what role he played in your own writing career that eventually led to this novel.
Yeah, okay, so short answer is Fred Waugh is a former poet laureate of Canada. So he's definitely esteemed in certain literary poetry communities in this country. And he was my creative writing professor, one of my creative writing professors at the University of Calgary when I was heading into my maybe 4th or 5th years. And he was fantastic because I had been writing poetry up until that point, but I hadn't really been thinking about myself and my own identity. And Fred, what's interesting about him, I mean, there are many interesting things about him, but he's part Chinese, but it's a very strange story where his father is half Chinese but lived in China, but the brother got to stay in Canada. And so anyway, so what Fred talks about a lot is this whole idea of the hyphenated identity. And he kind of poked and provoked me into thinking about hyphenated identity, and also I remember, how you say you cried when I gave you that edited draft. I remember him giving me a sheet, my poetry, my beautiful, precious poetry, and he'd written on it, cliche, 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 cliche.
No.
And I said, Fred, I need to get an A. Tell me what I need to do. And when he told me what I needed to do, I thought, okay, I can do this, which is just not take language for granted. Fred was a really valuable teacher for me, and then, I graduated, years went by, he became a very good friend as well. He and his wife, Pauline, I worked with his wife, Pauline, who's a Canadian literary critic. And out of the blue, one day he said, Suzette, you have to write about the sleeping car porters. And it was just out of the blue.
You had never mentioned it.
I'd
to
never
him.
mentioned it. I didn't know what he was talking about, and he doesn't even remember telling me to do that.
And you had no connection to sleeping car porter?
Nothing. But I think he thought, well, this is a part of Black history, and why don't you take it on? And the reason he wanted me to write about sleeping car porters was because, and I think people who were at the book club yesterday, I told this story, but when he was in his early teens, I think, he was a Boy Scout, or maybe he was even younger. Anyway, he was a Boy Scout, and he was on a train on the way to a Scout jamboree, and there was a porter on the train who discovered that Fred played the trumpet, and one day that porter cracked out a trombone and started jamming with the kids, with the Boy Scouts. And Fred said that was one of the most human experiences he's ever had on a train. And he, and what's so cool is that I have heard over and over and over again through the writing of this book there's so many people who've been impacted by sleeping car porters in some small way, by some small thing that a sleeping car porter did for them that was so nice. And for a lot of people, the sleeping car porters were the human part of the train, even though they had their own stories. They were, for a very long time, they didn't get to sleep. They didn't get proper hour, like they didn't get paid properly. They, all kinds of things. They didn't get to eat properly.
And so there's all the cars, and the sleeping car porters are in the sleeping cars,
They're
and
in the sleeping
they're
cars.
black. Are the other porters black, or it's just the sleeping car porters that are
No,
all black?
okay, so it depends on which part of history you're talking about. I know at a certain point, dining car waiters were also black men, but they were making a lot of money in tips. And so I think people started getting jealous. And depending on whichever company you were with, there were never black dining car waiters, but there were sleeping car porters. Black sleeping car porters. But when I was doing my research, I noticed that there was every so often a Ukrainian sleeping car porter.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I discovered that when I was going through the Henderson's directories for Winnipeg in the 20s, and you'd see every so often, a name like Lukashuk or Kostashuk, and it would say porter next to it.
Why do you think that?
It was, I think it was new immigrants looking for a leg up, and probably what happened for those porters, because they were white, was they were able to be promoted into the role of conductor or whatever else in those train companies, railway
What
companies.
year was it when Fred Waugh said you should write about sleeping car porters?
I think it was probably 2002.
21 years ago?
2003, yeah.
Did you write him and say thanks last year? Good idea,
I
Fred.
did. As soon as I finished the book, this is before anything happened, but when they were hot off the press and I got the box, I sent one off to him and I said, thank you so much for that conversation. And he wrote me back and he said, what conversation?
Didn't remember it. Yeah. He's one of the most humble people I've ever met.
He is.
So.
Yeah, this is part of the spirit of Coach House as well. He never cared about audiences. He was totally one of those poets who it's like, listen, if 5 people read this book, that's fine. That's great. I've done the work I wanted to do that I think is important.
I wasn't going to tell my own story, but I have to tell you this. Fred Waugh came to Fernie to give a speech in this big fancy venue, and it was called The Local. He talked about the local and what it means for a writer, the local, the local, the local. And my ex-husband never came to that event, but he came to this dinner afterwards at the golf course. And he ended up in this corner drinking beer and talking to Fred. And I kind of had my eye on this, thinking, like, everybody in this room is dying to meet Fred Waugh. And there's my husband, who has no idea who he is, drinking beer with him in the corner. And then he comes over for dinner. He's like, that guy's so nice. We were talking about the local. And I was just like, oh, my God. Yeah, because he's the keynote speaker who just, never mind. But Fred never even said, oh, I'm the keynote speaker.
No, he's great. Yeah.
No, yeah.
Very down to earth.
Yeah. And so between the time he told you that and this book was written, you written many other books, but this was on a back burner that you thought you would do eventually, or you didn't think you would do eventually?
I knew I had to have some kind of public project that I could talk to people about, and that I could use at work in order to pursue funding, because there's big pressure to pursue grant funding to help pay for grad students. I never thought I would write it. I thought I would just have it as an idea that I could fiddle around with.
Pull out at dinner parties.
Yeah, pull out at dinner parties, and also, promotion applications where you have to talk about, so what are you working on? When will it be out? And I'm like, yeah, it's going to be out.
Any day now.
Yeah.
Right around the next corner.
Sure. And, but then as I started writing more and more fake proposals for the book, it became more and more kind of like, maybe this wouldn't be so bad. And then when I finally got some money to go and do proper research, like actually go to archives and touch things, then I thought, oh, there's something magic here. That was part of the difficulty, was that I didn't know very much about the sleeping car porters. I knew nothing actually about sleeping car porters when I started. I didn't even know the difference between a steam locomotive and a diesel train. Like I didn't know anything. I knew absolutely nothing, and I wanted to know everything. I wanted to be confident enough to be able to do it, and I just didn't feel like I had the chops. And I think in hindsight it was good that it took as long as it did, because I didn't have the chops. I think I had to write like another couple books to be able to figure out how to do this and access this character.
And when did it become Baxter? Instead of the sleeping car porters, it became Baxter, the main character.
It was actually the parlor car. It was called the parlor car for a long time, and the character's name was Ted W., and he was a bigamist because he had a family on both sides of the line.
That's a
he was
different
a straight
novel.
guy, totally different novel. And he was also smuggling booze from Chicago.
Wow.
Yeah. When did it become, like, you mean the year?
Yeah, or what stage of the process was it? Okay, now I have Baxter, now I know what this book is doing, I guess.
I was doing research in archives And for a long time, I had this Ted guy with the two families, and I thought, I don't feel anything. I'm not feeling this. And then I thought, well, what if he has a gay lover in Winnipeg? And I thought, okay, that's making sense. But then that meant I had this family with the twins, and this family with the 3 kids, and then this guy, and then this porter, and I thought, that's too many characters. So the families kind of dropped away, and then I figured out that he was with this lover in Winnipeg. And then I was talking to Cheryl Fogo, and she said, well, of course he'd be having a relationship with another porter. And I was like, he is? And so I thought, okay, then, and then it just developed that way. So I would say probably I got that grant in 2012, but I also started doing my PhD around 2013, 2014. So I think the magic was starting to happen around there, where I was figuring out who this character was. And I also figured out it was really important to just get inside his head. I couldn't figure out how to connect with him, and so I thought, okay, he's a queer man, okay, that's okay. And then I also, in an act of desperation, fit of desperation, I thought, well, what would I do if I was in 1929 and I was a porter? And I thought, what would I be reading? What would I be wanting to do? And, because I'm interested in haunted house fiction, I thought, well, he'd be looking for supernatural fiction, He probably will be reading Dracula and H.G. Wells. He'll be reading Weird Tales magazine. And basically, I figured out that he was a nerd. And then that just made him come to life for me.
And obsessed with teeth, which we're not even going to talk about. That's a whole other, he wants to be a dentist, so he's obsessed with teeth. But we're going to leave the teeth because I have so much I want to ask you. But the other name that comes up that seems so far from Fred Wan, from all the serious research, is Daniel Levy's mom.
Yeah.
What's her role in this book?
Deborah Devine.
Deborah
is
Devine.
her name. I don't know very much about her except that she's Dan Levy's mom, and she also wrote this tweet when Schitt's Creek was doing so well, when it just burst out of the gates, and I think it got, what's the television award? Emmy, I guess? Anyway, it got an Emmy or a bunch of Emmys, and she wrote a tweet saying, and I think it's at the very back, I don't want to misquote it, but she said, she wrote a tweet where she said, today I regret every single second of worry back in the uninformed 80s, wondering how the world was going to treat my brilliant little boy, Dan Levy, who loved to twirl. Little did I know that he was going to kick that old world's ass to the curb and create a brand new one. And I thought, that is so adorable. And I thought, well, I want my character to twirl. So I plagiarized it, but then I wrote in the back that I stole it from her. So
at a point in the book, he finds this dirty postcard. It's a postcard with a sexual act on it, and he's keeping it. In the book club, everybody was very divided because somebody were like, he should have got rid of that. It made me so mad at him. He was going to get in trouble. And I was sitting here, am I the only one that feels differently? So I kind of looked around the room, and I met eyes with this one woman, and we're like, we think he should have kept the card. And we're like, it says he has these little acts of rebellion, and that's such a small act to have that picture. Like, we didn't want him to get caught, but we wanted him to keep it. And that's not a question as much as it's a literary analysis. But where did you get the idea of the postcard? And where did that, is that something you found in your research, that there was at 1929, these postcards?
That was part of my trying to do excavation or kind of research into queer men in history and how queer men might have lived, because so many of them hid their traces so very thoroughly. And I found a lot of really interesting information, but there was a book called Hard to Imagine, and it was about specifically gay male sexuality, but like photographic representations of that. And what I saw in there were, actually, you know what? I don't think I saw it in there, but I started learning about French postcards, French postcards, so postcards from Paris, which were illegal pornographic postcards, but the idea of pornography is much different from today. Like, literally, the pornography from the time would have been, there's a lady in a skirt with, riding a bicycle, and you can see her, what is
seam on her,
the seam on her,
eyelids.
What's it called? Garter. And you can see her garter, and I was like, woohoo! Or a lady climbing a ladder, and she's like this, So these were illegal, and I thought, I don't think I ever specifically saw one with two men, but I read that they existed, so I created one. Yeah.
It's interesting in the book because he's so constrained. Like, nobody can get his name right. He's scared of slipping up at all and getting demerit points and losing this job he has, even though it's not a very good job. He's so constrained. And then you made yourself quite a constraint in writing the book, that you were going to keep it. I mean, it's very expansive, the setting, in the sense that you're traveling across the country, but you're in one cart with one set of characters, and so really restrictive. It reminded me of constraint poetry almost, where you set yourself these rules, you can't go outside of it. Did you find that challenging to write within that box, or easier because you had a limited cast?
You're making me sound so smart. Really, it was really it was just panic, because I so didn't want to get historical details wrong, but I knew that there was a perfectly restored sleeper car in Cranbrook, BC. Cranbrook, BC, and I knew that I could visit that perfectly restored car anytime I wanted. And when I was in there, it was a time machine, because those archivists and historians who put it together, they did their homework. And I thought, okay, I know that the plates look like this. I know that the wood looks like that. I know that the upholstery looks like this. And as a result, the majority of the book is set on the train, because I was too scared to have him walk in the real world and maybe get it wrong, honestly.
And
But
did
it
you ever
works.
sit and write on that train? Did you sit in Cranbrook and write?
No, they don't let you. They don't let you. It's guided tours.
I know they're all so proud of you. When you came back to Cranbrook, everybody told me Suzette Mayr is coming to Cranbrook to speak at the train museum, and it was everybody feels a sense of investment in your
They
book.
were so nice to me. They were so nice to me, because there were the tours where you have to go in and you're just kind of rushed through. But then I said, please help me. I'm writing this book, please. And so I got like a private tour where I could ask all kinds of questions, and they were so good to me. They were so good to me.
I'm going to open it up. I feel like I could ask you questions for a week, but I am going to open it up to other people's questions. But I just want to ask you, I hope this isn't too personal, but all of us who were watching the Giller moment when you won the award, and I can hardly say this without crying, but your partner, Tanya, her reaction, she was so happy. And I know, she's so supportive of you, and she just obviously loves you so much and admires your work so much. And she was so completely overcome with emotion in that moment. And I just wondered, and in your books, you always thank her. And in this last one, you said, at the end, it says something like, words can't even, or you don't know how, but could you try to put words to what does a supportive spouse look like for a writer like you? In case there's any writers in the audience and their spouse could use some advice.
A supportive spouse is your greatest fan, and it's not that everything I do is gold, because it's not. She'll give me, I don't give her early drafts, but I'll give her drafts of novels when they're close to the end, and I kind of want a layperson's perspective. And she'll be very careful about, well, this is kind of boring, but she's very nice about it. But, she's always happy for me. There's no kind of sense of jealousy. It's like, okay, what do you need in order to write? I'll totally help you do whatever that is. So there was one point where, I think with Monoceros, there was a major, major deadline, and she said, okay, go to the basement, just go there for 3 days, and I will bring you food, and I will take care of the animals, and I will make sure the bills are paid. Just go there and finish. So that kind of very, and then she also celebrates with me with the little successes, and she also celebrates with me, when, like for me, the big joy of this book was I got it done. So we went for dinner. Like, how beautiful was that, and making everything a special occasion, because it is a special occasion. And so I try to do that for her as well. I mean, she writes in a completely different field. She does academic writing, but whenever she's published a peer-reviewed article, it's like, yay, let's go celebrate. So celebrating your person, and giving them space when they need it, and not resenting giving them space, and being happy for someone.
Yes, you could certainly see how happy she was for you, and I'm happy for you, and we have 10 minutes for other people's questions, and someone is coming down the stairs with a mic, and I feel like there's so much more to ask, Suzette, so I'm sure you all have questions, but if not, I will keep asking questions. There we go.
Hi, Suzette. So I was just thinking, listening to the speech, about how your book, The Sleeping Car Porter, has come out very coincidentally right around the same time as the CBC series, The Porter, which I think bears a bit more of a resemblance to your earlier draft of the book from the sounds of it. And I'm just kind of wondering if you were familiar with the series, if you how you view it in relation to your own work, and if you have a theory as to why these two similar projects both came up at the same time.
That's a lot of great questions. That's a lot, so I'm going to try to remember them all. I don't know why it was coincidentally at the same time, honestly, because also a couple years before, Cecil Foster's book had come out. I think the book was called Don't Call Me George or something like that, or They Call Me George. It was a nonfiction book about sleeping car porters. And I don't know why, especially because my book was cooking for 20 years. It's not like it came out when, shortly after I started it. But that Porter show, when I first heard about it, I had a moment of crisis because I thought, oh no, they've scooped me. But then I realized there is no way they've scooped me. There's no way we've written the same book, even though it's the same topic. And then what was also kind of delicious about it was that people thought I was writing the novelization of that television show, which I wasn't, but I'm like, sure, if that's gonna make you buy a copy, sure. I never watched the show. I deliberately stayed away from it because I was afraid that I would, I'd worked so hard to get all my historical details correct, and I was really worried that I would watch that show and then unconsciously internalize some detail that they had there or something, and it wouldn't be correct because it's television or movies. Like, I'm assuming they worked as hard as they could, but there's there's creative license you have to take. So I stayed away from it, but it was a wonderful moment to think that, and I talked about this with the book club yesterday, having the Porter out there before my book was actually really good, because what it did is it kind of prepped the public, whatever that is, it prepped people by showing them immediately, who the Porters were and what they looked like. So all you had to do was see those stills of the actors in their uniforms walking side by side, and people knew what it looked like. They knew, even just from hearing the hype around that show, the PR, they knew what Porters, probably this was going to be about unions and brotherhoods, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas, if my book had come out before there was any mention of the Porter, the television show or the streaming show, whatever it is, I wonder if it would have hit as well. Because I had to do so much world building. I think that television show, it was really serendipitous and wonderful that it came out. And I'm gonna wait till the year is out before I watch it, just so that all of the PR, et cetera, is mostly done for this book. But yeah, but I did have my mother write me. News of that CBC show appeared in the Globe and Mail or the Calgary Herald or something. She said, "You have to get your book out. You have to get it out now."
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah, no pressure, no pressure.
Oh, Mark has a question. And then one over there, too, after. There's a microphone right there, Mark. And then we don't have to repeat.
Thank you. What do you recognize as your greatest insecurity as a writer, and how do you overcome it?
She has no insecurities.
My greatest insecurity as a writer is I'm going to run out of ideas, and that there will be no next book. And that terrifies me, because the next book is what keeps me going in every sense of the term or the sense of the phrase. And right now I'm in a scary place because I've had this book for so long as the backup book that, when I've run out of ideas, well, I've always got this book, but now this book, I don't have this book anymore. And so right now I have the blank page, and the blank page terrifies me. And the only way you can get past it, or the only way I get past it, is by just showing up to the page regularly anyway, even if I have no ideas. So I have a kind of Zoom writers group where we meet every Sunday for 2 hours, and we, gossip a little bit, and then we just write for 2 hours. And I think Joyce Carol Oates or somebody said, or Isabel Allende, she said, if you sit there for 2 hours, something will come up, like something. As long as you're not fooling around doing research or, falling down those kinds of rabbit holes, something will come.
Working on your social media presence.
Yeah, no. And it doesn't even have to come in the form of words, you know. So I remember with Monoceros, when I was running into trouble, I ended up just doing scrapbooks, like, of illustrations of unicorns, just as a way to get my engine going. And then that was great, because I showed my scrapbook of, you know, unicorns to my friend Nicole, and she said, "You realize unicorns don't look like this, right?" Because they were all like Disney unicorns with eyelashes and whatever. And so she said, you know, do your research. And then I figured out all of these remarkable things about unicorns and how incredibly savage they are, and, you know, they're remarkable. And there was like an actual virgin cult associated with unicorns. So I thought, woo, you know.
You're making me want to read the book again. It's so good, you guys.
So right now, probably it's a mistake to mention this, but right now I'm really stuck, and I decided to do another scrapbook, and I'm doing a scrapbook of harpies.
Oh, exciting.
So it's just pictures and pictures and pictures of harpies. I don't know what that is.
Sounds exciting
I have no
to me.
idea. I'll find out next Sunday.
There was a question way over on this side. I asked the Sunday at your writing group. So you just have your cameras on and you just write.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we mute it, and then, yeah.
I was just want to get back to the book, Suzette, a bit. I was just amazed that this concept of demerits. There was intolerable tension as I was reading your book, and this concept of demerits that were totally arbitrary and so terrifying, and permeated the whole book. I'm just fascinated by that. Is that historical? Like, where did that come from, or what were you trying to accomplish with this overriding fear of these demerits? It went through everything.
Yeah.
And then people disappeared. Porters disappeared, and the other porters assumed there was, you know, a total demerits. I just interested.
Yes. So for people who haven't read the book, so sleeping car porters, historically, so the era I'm writing in the 1920s, certainly, if you were found guilty of doing something wrong, you would get demerit points. And what you didn't want to do was hit 60 demerit points, because if you hit 60 demerit points, you were automatically fired. And demerits, you could get demerits for anything. So I read in an archive in Chicago, the Pullman Archives, there was a guy who got demerits for stepping on the upholstery. There was another guy who got demerits because he didn't lock the lavatory door when they were parked at a station, and so somebody who was on the platform, you know, somebody used the toilet and it splashed up onto their coat, and so this porter got demerits. I knew that because so spoiler alert, not a lot happens in this book. It's more like a psychological study, I would say, until about the last 50 pages. That's just kind of how I feel. And I knew I had to have some other element of suspense to keep the reader engaged. So basically, the race in the book is between Baxter, the main character, not hitting the 60 demerits, but also getting enough in tips that he can leave this job. And it's kind of like, okay, you know, which is he going to get to first? Is he going to get to enough money and tips that he can leave this job and go to dentistry school and then be free of it? Or is he going to hit the demerits and then he's lost this job and he's in deep trouble? Demerits were real. They were 100% real, and they were used as the weapon of choice, especially by conductors or whoever who had it out for you. And it could be for small things, it could be for big things as well. And the one thing I could never figure out, though, was the number of demerits you could lose at a time. Like, was it units of 5, or was it just 1? So I was never able to find that out anywhere conclusively.
The thing that came up at the book club too is so he's under this constraint of not wanting to get the demerits and not wanting to lose his job so that he can get tips and go to dentistry school. But then also people talked about how isolated he was, because you also know people are spying on you, and the different porters, there might be a mole
Yeah,
looking
spotter.
for ways to get you demerited for something else, so they couldn't really even form any camaraderie. It's really, even though you don't get to the unions, it's sure an argument for the need for unions, this book.
Suzette, I was intrigued about your reference to Ukrainians as porters. In the Moose Jaw History Museum here, I was looking through it one day, and I found that the Moose Jaw Council passed an ordinance in Moose Jaw back in around 1920, or in that period, that no white woman would be allowed to work in a Chinese business. The exception was Ukrainian women.
Oh, interesting.
Yes, and I'm thinking because Ukrainians were really heavily discriminated against and not treated as really white, as white as a social construct as
Yeah.
such. If maybe that had some bearing on how they got into the porter business, I don't know.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's about that whole idea of conditional whiteness. I think Ukrainians were racialized people. I think, Ukrainians, Italians, Germans, they weren't considered white. White was Scottish or English I don't even know if Irish people were considered white. Honestly. Yeah, not in New York City. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right.
Do we have one more question? Nope, it's 5 o'clock on the nose, so we timed this perfectly. Thank you all so much for coming, and thanks again to the Cultural Center, and thanks most of all to Suzette Mayr.
Thank you. We forgot our water.